Hi there, this is Dr. Saboori, and today we will continue to talk about consumer choice theory, and we will do a couple of applications and dive a little bit deeper into it. So let's repeat briefly. Let's assume that you are living in a world where there is nothing but food and shelter. Shelter is abbreviated with the letter N. Don't ask me why. And food is abbreviated with the letter F. So food is on the x-axis, shelter is on the y-axis. We have an income of $1,200. Income is the letter Y. So given the income, given the price of food and shelter that we have, which is here $12 for food and $6 for shelter, we can calculate essentially the maximum amount of food and shelter that one can buy, given you spend all your money for food respectively shelter. And then by simply with that we figure out the what you see here, the intercept with the y-axis and the intercept with the x-axis. Connecting those two intercepts simply gives us the so-called budget line. Then the next thing that we introduced was the indifference curve, which is this thing here, this curve that you see, the blue one. And that one is kind of giving us an idea of the taste of the person or the needs of the person, if you want, so how many units of shelter with how many units of food the person that we are looking at would be willing to exchange. And so each indifference curve was representing a different level of utility, and what we figured out is the optimal bundle of consumption. And what we discussed next was the question, what happens actually if the price of a good increases or decreases. And then we saw, for example, let's assume the price of shelter increases. If you think about it, it means if you spend all your money on shelter, you can buy less shelter. But if you spend all your money on food, you can still buy the same amount of food. So this intercept doesn't change, whereas this intercept goes down. So we connect these two new intercepts with the x and y axis, and what we have is the new budget line. As you see, there is all this area of bundles of goods and services that we could consume before that we cannot consume anymore, because even though our income didn't change, it's the same. An increased price of shelter, let's say a substantial rent increase, leaves you just less money to spend on other goods and services, which is in this case represented by food. And depending on how much shelter you consume, if you consume a lot of shelter, the loss of your income possibilities is more significant versus someone who technically, let's say if someone was homeless, he was using no shelter whatsoever, that person isn't affected by rent prices going up or down. That person would spend all his money on food anyway. So that is a quick repetition of what we did in the last video. Now, the question now that I want to discuss with you is, what happens actually if prices remain the same but income changes, right? So let's say you have a higher income. For example, you're a poor person and the government decides to give you additional money or some food stamp, or you get some Section 8 help or something like that. Think of the scenario first. Let's say you get only money. Someone is giving you money, let's say every month, $300 or so. I want you to pause and think how the budget curve would shift, or maybe would it rotate? So pause the video please and think a little bit about it. So what we had before was that given the price of food of $12 per pound, an income of $1,200, I can consume a maximum of 100 pounds food per month, assuming that I spend all my money on food. So the intercept with the x-axis was 100. And for shelter, we had the situation that given the income of 1,200, price of shelter of $6 per square feet, if we do the math, what we see is that we can afford 200 square feet every month. Now, since our income has risen, it means we can now buy more food. With the income of 1,500, price of food is still at 12 dollars per pound. Now we can afford to buy, if you do the math, 125 pounds of food. What about shelter? For shelter, it's a similar situation. Higher income given the same price for shelter. It means that now I can afford more shelter as well. So if I spend all my money on shelter, I can buy 250 units of shelter. Let me put the N a little bit more to the side. Okay, and now all I need to do is connecting these two new dots with each other, and what I get is indeed my new budget line. And not surprisingly, this new budget line must be parallel to the old budget line, meaning that they must have the same slope. Why? Let's take a look into the previous week. You still have it, I still have it written here. As you see, the slope of the budget line represents the price of the good on the x-axis, which is in this case food, divided by the price of the good on the y-axis. So it is essentially nothing else than a price ratio of the price of the good on the x-axis divided by the price of the good on the y-axis. And if you take a look here, the prices have not changed. The thing that has changed is the income. The prices have not changed. Both prices are constant, so there's no reason why the price ratio should be changed. That's why the slope of the new budget line and the slope of the old budget line must be exactly the same. So what happens in conclusion is that raising the income generates all these new possibilities of consumption of all these new bundles of goods and services that is in this area that was not possible before. So clearly, given the new budget line that is higher, we can move from the previous in level of indifference, which was, let's say, here, which was a point of tangency, on a higher indifference curve, which is at the new point of tangency with the new budget line. And as you see, in the new budget line, we consume both more food in this case and more shelter. So the food consumption has risen from this quantity to that quantity, whatever that is, and the consumption of shelter has risen from this quantity to that quantity. Okay, so I cleaned up a little bit. Now we are consuming both more food and more shelter due to the increasing budget, which means that both food and shelter are normal goods, because with higher income we consume more of them. But of course that doesn't have to be always the case. Let's take a look into an example from the slides. In this example, as you see, the income has risen clearly. Why? Because what we see is a parallel shift of the budget curve outward, and in spite of the higher income, as you see, the consumption of veggies has gone down. So for this particular person, in this particular situation, veggies are considered as an inferior good. Now, veggies might not be the most typical example of inferior good, but if you think of, instead of veggies, if you think of very low quality ground beef, or maybe like noodles or something like that, higher income tends for most people to lower consumption of those goods. If preferences are in a way that an increase of income yields to the same percentual increase of consumption of all the goods and services, we call the preferences of that person homothetic. So again, homothetic means that the ratio of for example, in this case, rice to veggie consumption stays constant as income increases. So, for example, 10% higher income, that person increases the consumption of veggies by 10% and rice by 10%. If that is the case, then we call the preferences of a person homothetic. Now, as you see here, take a look here in how the curves look here in this graph, just the shape of the curve versus here the shape is kind of different. This is more like leaning down, whereas this is kind of more standing. So here is again the shape is somewhat different. So those difference in shapes determine in shapes of indifference curves determine a lot. So for example, if goods are normal goods or inferior goods, or it represents also what is the preference of a person towards the one good or the other good. Now, in empirical studies, we observe that as income rises, veggie consumption oftentimes rises relative to rice consumption. So, which means veggies are actually normal goods and not inferior goods. So, what you see in this example in the previous slide is not very typical. Usually veggies are normal goods. So maybe here instead of veggies, you maybe rather think of ramen noodle or something like that. So what we can do is tracking the income and see how changes in income changes the consumption of the different goods and services. If you want the more technical word for that, we can look into the income elasticity of demand. And the income elasticity of demand is essentially answering the question, per 1% change of income. So this is the absolute change in income, delta y. If you divide the absolute change of income by my income, what I get is essentially, that's the percentual change of income. We can also look into the percentual change of the demand for food. Now, if income change, let's say I lose some income, let's say 1%, my income goes down, leads to a less than proportional change of the income for food. So even though I lose 1% income, I only consume 0.5% less food. Then that means that food must be a necessity, right? Because I rather gave up more from other goods, but not so much from food. So where the demand reacts stronger on the income, in both ways, of course, then that is considered a luxury good. Where the demand elasticity of income is low, where the demand is inelastic, we call that a necessity, which makes sense, right? So if your income triples, you will not eat 3 times as much food, but you might buy 5 times, 6 times as much Starbucks coffee or something like that. And then the next thing to keep in mind is that as the price of a good changes, so let's say price of veggies go down, and veggies are normal goods, the consumption of veggies increases from this point to this point. We have a rise in consumption of veggies. Now, this consumption rise consists essentially of 2 effects if you think about it. One of them is called the income effect, which is obviously even though your income didn't change, even though your income didn't go up, but because the price of veggies has gone down, it is as if your income is higher, because that lower price of veggies allows you to have all these possible consumptions of goods and services which you couldn't have before. And then the second effect is called the substitution effect, which is essentially the fact that because price of veggies has gone down, but price of rice has remained constant, didn't change, veggies have become relatively cheaper compared to rice. So not only do I consume more veggies because I feel wealthier, since veggies are cheaper, I have these additional possibilities of consumptions, but also in particular I consume more veggies because veggies are now cheaper compared to other goods and services. So I consume more veggies, not only because I feel a little bit wealthier since veggies are cheaper, but also because veggies have become now a lot cheaper compared to rice. Okay, so we are primarily interested now in poor people and see how different government programs would change the situation for poor people. So let's assume government wants to help the poor, but they want the poor to be able to spend the money, the help that they receive, only on food and not on shelter. So food is again on the x-axis and shelter is on the y-axis. So if government gives them again the same amount of money, so $300 extra, but those $300 can only be spent on food and nothing else. So for example, not on shelter. I want you to pause the video and think about how that affects the poor. Okay, so again, for when it comes to food, the intercept with the y-axis has not changed. It's again the same calculation here that applies here. So the intercept here remains the same at 125 pounds of food that consumers can consume. However, when it comes to shelter, they cannot apply that money to shelter. So for shelter, there is essentially a cap. So consumers cannot spend more than the $1,200 income that they had on shelter. Now, what does that change for us? Our new budget curve is again a parallel line with the old budget curve. However, it is capped here. So this is how our budget curve kind of looks like. So it can go up only up to there. It starts again at 125, but here it's capped. So it does not contain that area where you could spend a maximum of $250 for shelter. Let's take a look into the analysis of if that makes a difference or not. And the answer would be, as often, maybe. It depends essentially on the consumer. For a consumer who would consume this quantity of, in this case, veggie, so in this case the government has allows the consumers to have more veggies. So for example, maybe the government is distributing veggies amongst the consumer. It would be the same thing as if you give the consumers money, and with that money they can only buy veggies and nothing else. For this consumer that we are observing here, whose optimal point of consumption was before here and now he ends up here, for this consumer nothing changes. This would be just as good as a cash transfer in the same amount. It would have essentially the same effect on consumption and well-being as a cash transfer of the same value. However, if you have another type of consumer who doesn't value veggie as much and would like to spend money on other things, that other thing could be anything, for example rice, for him that changes. Yes, the free veggie is an improvement, but you can see here by him switching or her switching from this indifference curve and to a higher indifference curve. However, if that same person would have received a cash transfer of the same value that would be equivalent to the same value of the veggies, that person would choose not this bundle of consumption but here. So he would choose actually less veggies and more of other goods, in this case rice. So that person could be slightly better well off, but he's not, because he has to now consume more veggies than what would be optimal based on his or her preferences. So you have it similarly here too when it comes, for example, to food stamps in the United States. Is a very similar effect. They don't want people to spend it on non-food items, or let's say on tobacco or alcohol or even other things that is non-food. So it's restricted to food. So for people who would buy food anyway, this is just as good as cash pretty much. But for people who would have liked to buy the other stuff, they cannot. So for them, you know, at least based on their preference, in their preferences, they would be on a higher indifference curve than not getting that transfer, than not getting the food stamps, but not quite as a high indifference curve as they would be if they could choose what they spend the money on themselves. So essentially, people who have very extreme preferences, they are not as good off. But those preferences might be, for example, if you think of tobacco or alcohol, might be due to some personal circumstances. So there's also some sort of a paternalism argument maybe here, that government kind of knows what is better for people than sometimes people know for themselves. That is summing up the first part of chapter 6. Chapter 6 has 3 parts of slides, and I will upload soon other videos for you.